I got lost on a Tuesday. That detail matters because on Tuesday the weather changes on the Kethsarevan Plateau. The pressure differential between the highland shelf and the canyon floor swings hard by late afternoon, and it takes the drone's atmospheric stabilizer with it when the calibration hasn't been updated to account for the season. Mine hadn't been. So at approximately 1440 on a Tuesday in the third month of my contract with the Compact Bureau of Path Survey and Grid Maintenance, my mapping drone did what the manual said it might under those exact conditions, which was nothing. It just stopped, sat in the air for a moment like it was thinking, then spiraled sideways into the scrub ravine and disappeared. I was 26 years old. I had been working the outer Velrath corridor grid for 8 months on a solo contract that paid well enough because nobody else wanted it. The corridor was 72 kilometers of Highland Trail system connecting 6 relay stations, and the Bureau needed the path markers updated, the erosion surveys filed, and the segment coordinates confirmed against the orbital index every quarter. It was the kind of work that suited someone who didn't mind silence. I'd always had a high tolerance for days that were mostly just walking and noting and adjusting, which was the overwhelming majority of what the job was. What I minded with real feeling, was the drone going down, because without it I was on foot with a 2-day food supply and a trail marker reader that would take me back to Relay 5 if I followed the right branch at the ravine junction. I followed the wrong branch. Not confidently wrong. I second-guessed myself at the junction for about 10 minutes, looking at the 2 paths and the reader's signal that should have distinguished between them and was giving me degraded output because of the same weather system that had taken the drone down. I chose left. Left was wrong. I didn't know that until evening, and I didn't know I wouldn't be correcting it until the second morning, when the reader finally cleared and showed me I had been walking east-southeast when I needed north-northeast. By then I had covered enough ground that doubling back would cost me more than going forward. I picked the next best heading and walked it. I know this because by the evening of the third day I was standing on a shelf of pale granite I had not stood on before, looking down at a valley I was not supposed to be in, and inside the valley were buildings. Low structures, stone and layered clay, arranged in a rough horseshoe around a central yard that had a fire pit and a community pot steaming in the late light. The buildings had no compact markings. There were no infrastructure panels, no relay antennas, no grid survey markers. There was a well with a hand crank mechanism. There were drying racks strung between 2 of the structures with what looked like long grass bundles and strips of cured hide. There were Velrath people in the yard, a dozen or so at a distance, moving between tasks the way people move when they are not performing anything for anyone, just doing the work that needs doing before the light fails. Their jade skin caught the late sun and turned it something between green and gold. One of them was sharpening a tool on a whetstone. 2 others were moving sacks of something from a storage building, the ordinary machinery of a settlement day winding down. I stood on the granite shelf and did the mental inventory a person does when they realize they have been somewhere they shouldn't go. This settlement had no compact registry marker that my reader could find. It was not in my grid index. That either meant it had been there so long the registry had flagged it obsolete and dropped it from the active grid, or it had never been in the registry at all, or my reader's database was out of date, which given my contract's technical situation was plausible. The third option seemed most likely. The Bureau updated its database on a 2-year rolling cycle, and my contract equipment had been drawn from the depot pool, which meant it might be running on older data. 11 years, I would later learn, was precisely how long it had been since anyone had updated the grid index for this part of the Highland Shelf. I did not go back the way I had come because I did not know which way I had come and it was getting dark. I went down the shelf to the valley. They saw me at the tree line. 2 of the adults, both Velrath, both taller than me by a handspan, with the pale jade skin and wide-set silver eyes that marked the Highland strain, stopped what they were doing and watched me walk across the yard. I held my hands open at my sides. No one spoke for a moment. Then an older woman came out of the largest structure and stood in the doorway and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has already assessed a situation before anyone has said anything about it. Her name was Velorith. She was the village's closest thing to a decision-maker, though the governance structure was more collective than that implies. She asked me, in formal compact standard, what I was doing there. I told her I was lost and my drone was down, and I needed to reach Relay 5. She said Relay 5 was 26 kilometers east, and that the trail from the valley floor would take me most of 2 days on foot, and that it was too dark to start now. I said I understood, and asked if I could sleep outside the perimeter. She looked at me for another moment, weighing something that I later understood was not suspicion of me specifically, but the general Velrath assessment of how much energy a stranger was likely to require. I was young and tired, and my hands were empty, and I had asked to sleep outside rather than inside, which she took as an indicator that I had some social calibration even if I didn't know much about them. She stepped back from the doorway and told me I could sleep in the grain store. It was not in use at this time of year because the harvest was 7 weeks out. I thanked her. She went back inside. That was how I came to be in the village of Kethsaravan, at the eastern edge of the Highland Shelf that no bureau survey had updated in 11 years, on the 3rd day of being lost on the Velrath outer corridor. The grain store was a low building at the back of the horseshoe, made of the same pale stone as everything else, with a heavy wooden door that swung in rather than out, and a floor of packed clay that was cool and dry. It smelled of dried grass and something faintly mineral, like the stone itself had a particular chemistry. There was a sleeping shelf along one wall and a folded piece of woven material on it that I recognized as a standard-issue compact trail blanket, old and soft with use. The blanket had been there long enough to take on the grain store's mineral smell. There was also a small stack of data cards on the floor near the wall, 2 deliberately placed to be accidental, and the corners of several of them were worn in the way that things get worn when they are handled repeatedly. I had been lying on the shelf for about an hour, not sleeping, when I heard something on the other side of the door. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound arranging itself into a presence. The way a person stands very still on the other side of something, holding their breath in a way that is meant to be inaudible but isn't quite, because the effort of holding it changes the quality of the air. I said in compact standard that whoever was there could come in if they wanted. The door opened about 20 centimeters. A face appeared in the gap low, at about the height of a Velrath child. Wide copper eyes, pale jade skin, silver-white braids that had been put up some time ago and had been coming undone since, the individual plaits loosening at the ends into tendrils that caught the faint light from the yard. She looked at me without speaking. She was not frightened, precisely. She was assessing. The copper eyes moved from my face to my pack to the shelf, and back to my face, with the systematic attention of someone making an inventory. I said hello. She said nothing. I asked if this was where she usually slept. A pause, then very quietly, yes. I told her I could sleep on the floor if she wanted the shelf. She thought about this for a moment, visibly. You could see the calculation in her face, which was the face of a child who had learned to think through decisions rather than react to them. Then she pushed the door open the rest of the way and came in and went directly to the far corner of the shelf, as far from me as the shelf allowed, and sat down with her knees tucked up and her arms around them and looked at me. I moved to the floor. I used my pack as a pillow. I lay there and she sat in the corner and neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "Your drone went down." I said yes. She said, "I heard it 3 days ago. It hit the scrub ravine." I asked how she knew it was mine. She said, "There is only one active survey contract on this grid." I read the public posting. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. A 7-year-old, I guessed 7, though I would later learn she was closer to 8, in an unregistered Highland village with no compact infrastructure, reading the Bureau's public contract postings. I asked her why. She said, Elder Velson, the keeper, used to read them. I read the files she left. I asked who Elder Velson was. A pause slightly longer than the others. She had a particular quality of pausing that I would come to recognize over the next few days. Not hesitation, but deliberate placement, choosing where to put the weight of the next sentence before she spoke it. She is the one who was keeping me, the child said. I let that sit. I said. 7 months ago, the child said. She got sick. It was fast. By the time the village sent to the nearest relay post for a medic, she was already gone. I asked what the child's name was. Velson, she said. She named me for herself, so I would always have someone named for me. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything adequate to say, and she wasn't looking for an adequate response. She had stated a fact. The fact was that an old woman had thought carefully about what a child needed and had given her the most durable thing available, a name that could not be taken back. After a while the child's breathing evened out, and I understood she had fallen asleep sitting against the wall in the corner. I did not move her. I lay on the clay floor and thought about a woman who had named a child for herself, so the child would always have someone, and then gotten sick on a highland plateau far from any relay post, and been dead before help could arrive. The data cards near the wall had been handled many times. Someone small had read them many times. I did not touch them. They were hers. In the morning, I asked Velorth about the child. We were at the community pot, which was already going by the time I came out of the grain store. The other village adults drifted in and out of the yard, filling bowls, moving to their work. The child was not there yet. Velorth poured me a bowl of something thick and grain-based that I recognized as a Velrath staple. The grain was called Velketh. It grew in the highland meadows and had a faint bittersweet taste when cooked in the traditional ratio, and looked at me in the particular way of someone waiting for the real question. I asked it, who was responsible for the child now? Velorth was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the elder had held the keeper claim under Velrath tradition, a formal adult claim that established care responsibility, binding and witnessed by the community council, recognized by the compact registry as the Velrath analog for guardianship, and that when the elder died the claim had dissolved with her. No one in the village had claimed the child since. I asked why not. Velorth looked at her bowl. She said it was complicated. The child was smart, very smart, in a way that made some of the adults uncomfortable. She read things. She asked questions that were hard to answer, not because the answers were difficult but because the questions were precise enough to exclude the easy deflections adults used with children. She had been the elder's project for so long that no one quite knew how to take her on. And there was also the matter that under Velrath tradition, an adult claim created a significant obligation. It was not a casual thing. It was a binding commitment, witnessed and registered, and several of the adults who might have been willing had obligations already, children of their own, and the village had been having a hard year. The spring sowing had been partial, because 2 of the main planting workers had been dealing with a sickness that spread through 4 of the families in early summer. She said it plainly and without apology. I understood she was not defending the situation, just describing it. She was not comfortable with what she was describing, but she was honest about it, which I respected. I asked if the child was eating. Velorth said she ate from the community pot, whenever she got there before it ran low. I asked if that was every day. A pause. Most days. I went back to the grain store and found the child awake, sitting cross-legged on the shelf with one of the data cards in her hands. The kind the Bureau used for field documentation, small and flat with text on both sides. She was reading it the way someone reads something for the fourth or fifth time. Quickly, with their eyes moving in short jumps, processing rather than taking in new information. I told her the pot was on, and she should go eat. She said she had already eaten, which was not what Velorith had said was typical. I asked what she had eaten. A pause. Yesterday's bread, she said, and there was something in the way she said it that told me there had not been very much of yesterday's bread, and she had decided to call it breakfast rather than go to the pot and risk finding it empty and come back having done neither. I took an emergency ration bar out of my pack and put it on the shelf next to her. She looked at it, she looked at me. The copper eyes were careful about both. I said it tasted like pressed grain with a sweet coating and was not very good. She picked it up. She ate half of it immediately, unhurriedly, with the focused attention of someone eating because they need to rather than because it's pleasant, and then wrapped the other half in a piece of cloth she took from her pocket and tucked it away. The cloth was already there for this purpose, already folded the right size. I understood without needing to be told that this was a practiced habit. She had been doing this for a while. I sat down on the floor and asked if she wanted to show me the data cards. She considered me for a moment. Then she said, "All right." She had, in the 8 months since the elder's death, read every file the elder had left on the data card stack. These were the elder's records. The village's population count going back 30 years, the seasonal planting and harvest logs, the water source assessments, the correspondence with the compact registry office that had occurred 11 years ago, and then stopped, the public contract postings the elder had been monitoring for reasons the child understood better than I did, and a set of notes the elder had written in her own hand about Velorith administrative law and compact interface regulations, and the specific provisions that applied to unregistered highland settlements. The last category was the largest. The elder had been a thorough woman. She had cross-referenced provisions. She had noted where the Velorith traditional law and the compact administrative code overlapped, and where they conflicted, and which took precedence under which circumstances. She had annotated her annotations. The child had read all of this. She had read the administrative law sections at least twice. The margins of several cards had small notations in a second hand, tinier and more cramped than the elder's, which I understood were the child's own notes on the elder's notes. I sat with the stack and looked at them while she talked. She talked about the provisions the way someone talks about something they have spent a long time with a kind of ownership that is not possessiveness but familiarity, the way you talk about the layout of a building you have lived in for years. She knew where each card was in the stack. She knew which ones to pull for which purpose. She knew which provisions connected to which others. The elder had been doing something deliberate. She had been educating this child in the precise knowledge that a child in this specific situation would need. Not general education, not village history or agricultural technique or Velorith social custom. Specific, targeted, survival-level knowledge about the administrative system that surrounded the village like a net. The system that would, eventually, notice the child. I asked Velsan if she understood what the elder had been teaching her. She said she was teaching me the rules, so I could know when someone was using them correctly and when they weren't. I said she knew this situation was coming. Velsan set down the card she was holding. She looked at it for a moment, not at me. She said she knew she was sick before she told anyone else. She had been sick for several months before it got fast. She didn't tell anyone because there was nothing useful for anyone to do about it, and she didn't want the attention. A pause. She said useful attention was the only kind worth having. I asked if there was a compact communication relay in the village. She said there was a relay terminal in the elder's old quarters. The elder had maintained it herself, paying for the connection out of whatever small compact stipend came to the village for its registry status, which had not been fully deregistered even after the active grid update lapsed, and it was still active, but no one else in the village knew how to use it. The compact terminal interface required a user certification that none of the other village adults had, because none of them had needed it. The elder had been the interface between the village and the wider compact system, and when she died, that interface had died with her. Velsan looked at me. I said I knew how to use a compact terminal. She said, I know. Survey contractors are required to have basic compact terminal certification as part of their licensing. It's in the Bureau's standard contract specifications. I said that was correct. She said, you could file a status update on this settlement. If you filed a status update, it would trigger a registry review. A registry review would require the registry office to send a compliance team, and the compliance team would have to document the settlement's current status, including its dependent population. I looked at her, 8 years old, sitting on a shelf in a grain store, with half a ration bar wrapped in cloth in her pocket. I asked if she wanted me to do that. She looked back at me steadily. I want to know, she said carefully, what a compliance team would do when it arrived. Because I have read the relevant provisions, but I want to know what actually happens, not just what the provisions say should happen. I told her I didn't know exactly what would happen. Compliance teams varied. They had instruments, dependent classification instruments, that could route unregistered juvenile dependents to compact processing nodes for assessment and placement. I told her that if the instrument was applied to her, she would be taken off the plateau. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Section 14(c) of the Compact Dependent Protection Code says that a dependent classification instrument cannot be enforced if there is a compact-recognized adult in physical proximity who has filed a companion of record challenge within the instrument's 48-hour response window. I said that was correct. She said, are you a compact-recognized adult? I said yes. She said, would you be willing to file the challenge if a team arrived with the instrument? I sat with that for a moment. She was not asking me to lie or to claim any relationship that did not exist or to do anything the code did not explicitly permit. She was asking if I would stand in a doorway for 48 hours and say, I am here. I am compact recognized. I am filing the challenge. The provision required physical proximity and a filed challenge from a compact recognized adult. It did not specify the nature of the relationship. It specified the presence and the filing. That was all. I said yes. She nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already decided. Then she said, you should know that I have already sent the status update. I sent it yesterday before you woke up, using the elder's terminal. I looked at her. She said, I did not know you would be willing to file the challenge. I only knew that the situation needed to change. A compliance team arriving is better than no change, even if the outcome was uncertain. I said, you sent it before you knew if I'd help. Yes, she said, but I thought you might. You slept on the floor. She picked up the next data card in the stack and went back to reading. The compliance team arrived on the morning of day 4. There were 2 of them, a senior compliance officer named Velthar Orvek, tall and gray-skinned, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent a long time doing institutional work, and had stopped being surprised by what he found, and a junior officer who carried the instruments and said very little. They came up the valley trail with a small transport, and parked at the tree line, and walked into the yard with the particular energy of people who expected to complete a task and leave. Velorith met them in the yard. I stood in the grain store doorway. Velsan was inside the grain store, behind me, sitting on the shelf with her data cards. She had arranged herself so that she was visible through the doorway if anyone looked, but not in a way that seemed deliberate. She was just sitting there reading. Velthar Orvik scanned the yard, registered me, and walked across. He was a thorough man. He had already assessed the settlement, the number of structures, the population visible in the yard, the absence of compact infrastructure, and had noted me as the anomaly. He stopped in front of me with the careful professionalism of someone who does not want to treat a situation as more routine than it is. He said he had received a status update filing on this settlement, and was here to conduct a compliance review and document the current status of all registered and unregistered dependents. I said I understood. He said the settlement had no active keeper claim on the juvenile dependent Velson, as of the last registry update. I said that was correct. He said that under those conditions, his office was authorized to issue a dependent classification instrument and route the juvenile to the nearest compact processing node for assessment. I said I understood. He looked at me. He had the expression of someone who had expected this to be simpler and was adjusting his expectations in real time. I said, I am filing a companion of record challenge under Section 14C of the Compact Dependent Protection Code. I am compact recognized under my survey contractor certification, number VR 7741F, active through the end of this contract period. I am in physical proximity. I am filing the challenge now. I handed him my contractor badge. He looked at it, he looked at me, he said, "You're a path surveyor." I said, "Yes." He said, Section 14C is intended for established care relationships. It is not intended to allow a passing contractor to delay classification of a dependent who has been unattended for 7 months. I said, the provision doesn't specify the duration of the relationship. It specifies physical proximity and compact recognition. I meet both. He said, the challenge will trigger a 48-hour review period. During that time, you are required to maintain physical proximity to the dependent. I said, I understand. He said, you intend to stand in a doorway for 48 hours. I said, I intend to maintain physical proximity to the dependent for the duration of the review period, yes. He looked at my badge again. He looked at me again. There was nothing technically wrong with what I was doing, and he was professional enough to know it, and he was thorough enough to have checked the provision in his head before he spoke and confirmed that I had cited it correctly. He said, the challenge is noted. The review period begins now. He handed my badge back. He walked back across the yard to where his junior officer was waiting and said something I couldn't hear, and the junior officer made a notation on his instrument. They did not leave. They made their camp at the tree line and settled in to wait. I stepped back from the doorway but did not leave it. Velson said from behind me, you filed it. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what happens in 48 hours? I said, the review board receives the challenge, assesses whether it's valid under the provision, and either upholds it or dismisses it. If they uphold it, the instrument is put on hold, and the case goes to a longer review. And if they dismiss it, then the instrument applies, and they take you to the processing node. What would happen at the processing node? I said, assessment. They determine your status, look for possible placement with a registered family or community. It wouldn't necessarily be permanent. Wouldn't necessarily, she said. No. What do you think they'll do with the review? She asked. Uphold or dismiss? I thought about it honestly. I thought about Vilthar Orvik's face when he looked at my contractor badge. I thought about the fact that I had cited the exact provision correctly, and he had not found an immediate counterargument, which meant either there wasn't one or he needed time to research whether there was one. I said, I think the provision is clear and I think they'll uphold it, but I don't know for certain. What will you do if they dismiss it? Argue it, request the reasoning in writing and contest it. You're not a lawyer. No, but I'm here and I'm compact recognized and I read the same sections you read. Your elder was thorough. A pause. So were you. She didn't say anything to that. I heard her settle on the shelf. After a while she said, "You should eat something." I said I had rations. She said, "The other half of the bar from this morning is in my right pocket if you want it." I told her to keep it. She said I already ate my half. I was being practical. I took the second half of the bar. It tasted like pressed grain with a sweet coating. It was not very good. I ate it standing in the doorway watching Velthar Orvik's camp at the tree line, and I stayed where I was. The village did not ignore what was happening. Velorith came to the grain store at mid-morning and stood near the doorway and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "You know this may not work." I said I knew. She said, "Why are you doing it?" I said I wasn't sure. I had a complicated answer. The provision existed. She met the conditions. Standing in a doorway for 2 days was not a significant sacrifice on my part. Velorith looked at me with the expression I was beginning to understand, was her expression for someone who had said something that she was deciding was either very wise or very naive. After a moment, she seemed to settle somewhere between the two, which was probably accurate. She brought me water that afternoon. Good Highland water, cold from the well, in a clay vessel. She set it down near the doorway without saying anything about it, without making it an occasion. That was, I understood, how she did most things. 2 of the other adults, Velsorn and Velmara, whose names I had learned by then, came and looked at the compliance team's camp, and then came and looked at me. They didn't say anything directly, but by the end of the first day, there was a meal set at the grain store door that I had not been asked about. Warm grain porridge with the dried fruit they preserved from the summer harvest. A good proportion of the good bittersweet Velketh with the ratio right, the kind of meal that requires attention to make. The child ate from it too, sitting in the doorway while I sat just inside it, close enough to maintain the physical proximity requirement, the 2 of us eating without discussion. On the second afternoon, Velorith came and sat on the step near the doorway and said, without looking at me, "The elder would have liked you." I said I was sorry I hadn't met her. Velorith said, "She was not easy to like in the first hour. She was very direct. She had no patience for people who talked around things." I said the child was similar. Velorith said, "Yes." A pause that was also in its way a conversation. She said, "She read everything in the elder's files. We knew she did it. We let her. It seemed like what the elder wanted, and we didn't know how to engage with what she was becoming, so we let her become it in the grain store and we didn't look too hard." I said, "The elder left very specific files." "Yes," Velorith said. "She was a careful woman. She knew what she was doing." She was quiet for a moment. I think she knew she didn't have much time left even before she got sick. I think she had been preparing that child for years. Not just for the administrative situation. For whatever came. A pause. For the part where she was gone and the child was still here. We sat there for a while. The compliance team was still at the tree line. Velthar Orvik had come to the doorway twice to check my physical proximity, and each time I had been there, and each time he had gone away again without saying much, and each time the child had not looked up from her data cards. Velorith said, "If the review upholds your challenge, we will need to address the permanent situation." I said yes. She said, "The adult claim is a serious commitment. I have been thinking about it since yesterday morning." She did not say she had been thinking about it for longer. She said since yesterday morning, and I understood she was being precise about when the thinking had shifted from ambient guilt to actual consideration. I said I was glad to hear it. She said, "It should have been done immediately. The village we should have done it immediately." She stopped. She was the elder's project for so long. We didn't know how to be her people without the elder. I said, "She's been feeding herself from leftover porridge and saving half of ration bars." Velorith was quiet. I said, She's not asking for anything she thinks she doesn't have the right to ask for. She read the provisions because she needed to understand the rules before she could know if anyone was breaking them. She sent the status update on her own because she decided the uncertainty of a compliance team arriving was better than no change at all. She didn't know I'd file the challenge. She did it anyway. Velorith said after a moment, "How old are you?" I said 26. She said, "The elder would have said you are what happens when someone takes the trouble to be taught the right things at the right age." She looked at the compliance team's camp for a moment. She said that about the child too. I said I didn't think I'd done anything particularly notable. Velorith said, "No, I know that's what I mean." The 48 Tower Review Board notification arrived at 7:40 on the morning of the third day. I was standing in the doorway. Velsan was sitting on the shelf. I had been on my feet for most of the night because I had made myself stay awake. I had not been certain it was a requirement of the provision, but physical proximity was a phrase that could be interpreted broadly or narrowly, and I had decided not to give anyone reason to argue narrow. The child had woken twice in the night, and each time she had looked at the doorway, and each time I had been there, and each time she had gone back to sleep without saying anything. Velthar Orvek walked across the yard with his junior officer. He had the expression of someone who had spent 48 hours in a field camp on a highland plateau, eating whatever was in their travel kit, which was not nothing but was not the village's Velketh porridge either. He was not pleased about it, in the measured way of a professional who separates personal discomfort from professional conduct. He stopped in front of me. He said, "The review board has assessed the companion of record challenge filed under Section 14. See, the challenge is upheld. The dependent classification instrument is placed on formal hold pending completion of a standard care status review, which will require documentation of a permanent adult claim within 60 days. I said, "Understood." He said, "The survey contractor certification is not a standard basis for a 14C challenge. The board noted that the provision does not exclude it but noted it." I said, "I understand." He said, "You have 60 days to document a permanent adult claim. If no claim is documented, the instrument activates automatically." I said, "The village is aware." He looked at me with the expression of a man who had come to a remote highland plateau expecting a routine task and was leaving with something more complicated. He said, "The child read the provision herself." I said, "Yes." He said, "She sent the status update." I said, "Yes." He said, "She understood that triggering a compliance visit might not go in her favor." I said, "She understood that uncertainty was better than nothing. She decided the risk of the compliance process was better than the certainty of staying in the grain store for the rest of the harvest season, and then the winter after that." Velthar Orvek looked past me at the grain store interior, and then looked at me. He said, "The provision exists for cases like this. It was written specifically for cases like this, when the technical requirement for an adult's presence could protect a child from a mechanism that was working faster than the social fabric could repair itself. The mechanism is not wrong, but it can arrive before the people involved have had time to become who they need to be." He paused. "It is not often invoked by a path surveyor." I said I was available. He said, with something that might have been the beginning of a dry respect, "You were, in fact, available." He signed the hold notification on his instrument and handed me the confirmation. He turned and walked back to the tree line. He and his junior officer broke their camp. They took the transport up the valley trail. They were gone by mid-morning. The village elder council convened that afternoon. I did not attend. I was not a village member and it was not my business. I sat with Velsan in the grain store and she read her data cards, and I ate an actual meal that Velmara had left at the door and kept my mouth shut about things that were not mine to say. After about 2 hours, Velorith came to the door. She said that the council had convened and Velmara had filed the adult claim under Velrath tradition, with the council's witness, and that it would be documented and sent to the compact registry within the week, well inside the 60-day window. She said Velsan will move into Velmara's house. Velsan was quiet for a moment on the shelf. Then she said, Velmara has 2 children. Velorith said, yes. She plants the south field. Yes. She doesn't have time for a third. Velorith said, she has decided she does. Velsan was very quiet. I watched her hold the data card she had been reading without reading it. She was looking at the wall. I did not say anything. This was not my moment, and there was nothing useful I could contribute to it. Then she said, what about the grain store? Velorith said, the grain store will continue to be used for grain. A pause. Will I be able to use the Elder's terminal? Yes. Velmara has agreed that you may maintain access to the Elder's records and the terminal, under supervision, until you are older. Velsorn will learn the interface certification, so that there is more than one adult in the village who can operate it. Velsan turned the data card over in her hands. She turned it back. She was processing something that was larger than she was letting show in the way she processed everything, inward first, outward second, and only what needed to go outward. She said, all right. Velorith said, we should have done this 7 months ago. Velsan said, you didn't know how. No, Velorith said, we didn't know how. Velsan looked at the data card. She said, the Elder wrote a note about this in her files, not about the specific situation, but generally. She wrote that sometimes people do not know they are able to do a thing until the consequence of not doing it becomes impossible to look at. She looked at Velorith. I think the compliance team was the consequence, she said. Velorith said, I think it was. That evening Velsan moved her few things, the data cards, the trail blanket, a small carved piece of highland granite that had been the Elder's, a cloth that served as a case for the carved piece, from the grain store shelf to Velmara's house. I watched from the doorway. I did not help. She did not ask for help. She carried the data cards in 3 trips because she was small and there were a lot of them, and she was methodical about it, stacking them with their edges aligned when she put them down. And when the last trip was done, she came back to the grain store doorway and stood in front of me and looked up. She said, your drone came back online. I saw the signal on the terminal this morning. It must have stabilized in the ravine overnight and recharged on the passive solar cycle. I said I'd noticed. I had checked it an hour ago through my contractor reader, and it was responsive and its position was logged. She said, Relay 5 is 26 kilometers east. The valley trail connects to the highland path at the upper junction. If you start at first light, you should make it by the second evening. I said that was the plan. She looked at me for a moment. She was 8 years old and she had saved half a ration bar, both times, and she had sent a status update into the compact registry alone on a highland plateau before she knew if anyone would stand in a doorway. And she had read administrative law by whatever light was available in a grain store for 8 months, and she had asked a path surveyor she had never met whether he would file a form. She said, thank you. I said it was fine. She said it wasn't nothing. I said, no, it wasn't nothing. She nodded. She turned and went into Velmara's house, and the door closed behind her. I left in the morning. Velorith walked me to the valley trail. She gave me a Highland Pass disc, a marker used by Velrath travelers to signal they had been formally acknowledged by a settlement community, which entitled them to basic hospitality at any connected village along the highland routes. It was a flat piece of dark stone about the size of my palm, with the Kethsaravan settlement mark carved into one face. The carving was clean and old. The mark had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. She said it would be useful if I was ever lost on the plateau again. I said I hoped not to need it. She said keep it anyway. I kept it. I filed my path survey report at Relay 5 2 days later. In the section for anomalous discoveries, I noted the settlement at Keth Soravan, its approximate population, its status as an unregistered Velrath Highland community, and the fact that it had a functioning relay terminal and a population that included at least one juvenile dependent whose care status had been regularized under both Velrath tradition and compact administrative law during my visit. I noted the settlement's approximate coordinates and the trail access from the Highland Junction. I noted that the grid index should be updated to reflect it. The Bureau filed the update 6 weeks later. The compact registry confirmed the adult claim documentation within the 60-day window. I finished my contract 2 months later and went back to the corridor cities for a while, and then took another contract, this time on a different grid, because the outer corridor was beginning to feel like familiar ground, and familiar ground had never suited me well. I still have the pass disc. It sits on the shelf above my work desk wherever I happen to be working, which has been 7 different places in the years since the Highland Plateau. It is dark stone and it fits in my palm, and it has the Keth Soravan settlement mark on one face and nothing on the other. People who see it ask what it is. I tell them it's a marker from a Highland village I visited once, when I was lost on a survey contract and my drone went down. They usually ask if anything interesting happened. I usually say, not really. I filed a form and stood in a doorway. Which is true. That is what happened. A 26-year-old path surveyor with a contractor badge and a basic certification filed a form under a provision written for exactly that kind of situation, and stood in a doorway for 48 hours and went home. The child is, as far as I know, still on the Highland Plateau. She is several years older now. She has Velmara's house and the elder's files and access to a terminal, and presumably Velsorn's newly acquired interface certification to draw on when she needs it. She has, by now, probably read considerably more administrative law than I have ever read, which was not a high bar but is still worth noting. She saved half the ration bar both times I gave her one. That is the detail that stays with me most clearly when I think about the grain store. Not the compliance form or the 48 hours or the review board's decision or the way Velthar Orvek said you were, in fact, available. The way she wrapped the second half in a cloth and put it in her pocket. The way she had learned, over 7 months alone in a place where the community pot sometimes ran low, to always keep something for later. The cloth was already folded the right size. She had made the habit and made the tool for the habit at some point early on, when she understood that later was a thing she needed to prepare for. She is a careful person. The elder made her that way. The elder spent years making her that way and knew exactly what she was making and why. I think about that sometimes, when I am on another grid and another plateau, and the drone is working fine, and everything is going as planned. I think about a woman who saw what was coming, and who named a child for herself, so the child would always have someone, and who spent however many years she had left teaching that child the exact knowledge she would need, down to the specific provisions and the exact section numbers, and who died before she could see whether it worked. She didn't know a path surveyor would show up. She couldn't have planned for that. She planned for everything else. She planned for the child to know Section 14C. She planned for the child to know how to read a terminal certification requirement in a bureau contract posting. She planned for the child to understand that uncertainty was better than nothing, which is a more sophisticated position than most adults I know hold, and which an 8-year-old holds because someone thought carefully about what an 8-year-old would need. That is what a careful person does. Plans for everything they can plan for, and then trusts that the rest will work out because the planning was thorough enough to give the rest something to work with. The disc on my shelf is evidence that she was right.